Okay, today we are learning about Langston Hughes. And I know for one of my sections I've already gone through the bio, but in the other section we didn't quite get to it. So I'm just going to go ahead and do a quick recap of Hughes's biography. I'll just bring these points up here. So he did have a really difficult growing up years. His parents were divorced, and so he was just one of those kids who got shuffled around to a lot of different places. Lived with his grandmother for a time, for his mother, for his father. So as a young person, he really gained some early independence and was widely traveled. He had a lot of odd jobs here and there. I really encourage you to read the biography in your textbook because it's interesting. He was very interested in poetry from a young age, was always writing poems, was very politically active, which brought him to being the most well-known author of the Harlem Renaissance. So the Harlem Renaissance was a cultural movement that spanned the 20s and 30s. And the reason we call it the Harlem Renaissance is because Harlem, the borough in New York City, housed a growing African American middle class. And this was a brand new type of American. And many of these people were first generation free men. And so, if you think about the identity piece of that, their parents had actually lived through slavery and bore the literal scars of the evils of slavery on their bodies. And so, to be able to come from that heritage and yet trying to find yourself in this new America where there is no longer overt slavery, however, there's still quite a bit of really awful racial oppression, was a difficult thing to carve out a new identity for themselves. So, some common themes in movement, in content that we see in the Harlem Renaissance: overt racial pride in the new Negro, and that's the term that they use for themselves. We are the new Negroes of this time period. And a lot of self-determination and focus on identity. What does it mean for me to be African American? And ownership of African American culture. There is a reason that the 20s was called the Jazz Age. And we know that the musical genre of jazz finds its roots in African American culture. And this is the first time that Black people are really given a voice in American culture and carving out that unique voice. So we see that through the poetry that we're studying here by Langston Hughes. So the poem I had you guys read by him is called Theme for English B, which is a great poem for students. It should resonate with you because it is written from the perspective of a student. So let's start by looking at this poem. This is on page 844, and I'm just going to point out a few things. So the first 5 lines, the instructor said, "Go home and write a page tonight and let that page come out of you, then it will be true." So the speaker of the poem, this young student, is given the assignment to write a paper about himself. And this is something that students are familiar with, introduce yourself, write me a paragraph about yourself. And usually that's not too hard. But if you really dig down deep, that can be a difficult thing to figure out. Who am I? That's the question we're all trying to answer about ourselves, right? Even a lot of adults don't have like a full grasp on what truly makes up their identity. So this is a really challenging assignment for him. And it's interesting that this first section of the poem especially, but throughout, there are a lot of first-person pronouns. So let me point out a couple other things here. I'll read a little bit. So line 6, "I wonder if it's that simple. I'm 22, colored, born in Winston-Salem. I went to school there, then Durham, then here, to this college on the hill above Harlem." So it's funny, he kind of starts like the wheels spinning, like the normal things you say about yourself. If someone says, "Oh, tell me about yourself," you're like, "Oh, well, I'm this old, this is where I'm from, this is where I go to school." For you guys, it's like, this is my major, this is my sport, this is what I do, this is the music I like, or whatnot. So I think you can identify with that. And it is interesting, though, that something that most of us would not say is our race. right? Like, I'm not going to be like, I'm Sarah Bailey, I'm an English teacher, I grew up in Greenville, and I'm white, right? Because, in our context, it's not as significant, but he includes that. So all these first person pronouns just reflect the fact that he's exploring his identity. He's trying to figure out who he is, especially in this context where he talks about how he is the only Black student in his class, right? And he is very upfront about how difficult it is. If you look at line 16, he says, "It is not easy to know what is true for you or me at 22, my age." So this is difficult. I'm not sure what my identity is. So he talks about some other things, what he likes, things he enjoys, music, learning. But then he gets to the meat of the issue, which is the racial tension here. So I want us to specifically focus in on lines 25 to 35. So I'll just read these for us. He says, "I guess being colored doesn't make me not like the same things other folks like who are other races. So will my page be colored that I write? Being me, it will not be white. But it will be a part of you, instructor. You are white, yet a part of me, as I'm a part of you. That's American. Sometimes you don't want to be part of me, nor do I often want to be part of you." So it's interesting, he talks about this idea of being American, and he says that, he's actually directly addressing his teacher and says, "You are white, but you're part of me as I'm part of you. That's American." And here we have this new American idea of what some people used to refer to as the melting pot or the salad bowl, that part of what makes us American is our diversity, right? Finding unity in diversity. And he says, you know what? You're white, I'm Black. You are part of this class, I'm part of this class, and that's what makes us American, right? He does acknowledge that it has its challenges, right? So some of the challenges it presents, and I think it's really cheeky for the narrator, the speaker of this poem, to actually say this to his teacher. Look at, I'll go back to line 34. He says, "Sometimes perhaps you don't want to be part of me. So maybe you don't want a Black kid in your class, right?" But then he comes right back and says, "Nor do I often want to be part of you." And he says, "Well, I don't really care to have a white teacher right now." But then he kind of says, "We are. That's true. This is reality. This is the fact of our current American state." And then these last lines are so powerful and so compelling. He says, "As I learn from you, I guess you learn from me, though you're older and white and somewhat more free. This is my page for English B." So the challenges obviously is the racial tension in America. However, the reward is that they can learn from each other. And that is true. No truer words have ever been spoken that a good teacher should learn from his or her students. I learn amazing things from my students all the time as they bring a different perspective to the content that I'm teaching. So again, he brings that tension forward in a really compelling way to make us think about how difficult it is for him to challenge this. But the tone of it is really powerful in that it's a little lighthearted, but yet there's also an edge to it, right? So he is pushing his agenda of the search for racial equality, of bringing a spotlight to racial oppression and the racial divide, right? However, he couches it in these terms: "As I learn from you, I guess you learn from me, although you're older and white and somewhat more free." So he uses terms like "I guess," "perhaps," "somewhat." He's not being in your face about it. And that was really powerful, important for him to have that kind of tone, so it's not coming across, he's not alienating his audience right from the get-go, but he's inviting us to enter the conversation and think through these things with him. So again, overarching themes here, obviously race, equality, identity, but a really neat poem by Langston Hughes. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, let me know if you have questions. And we'll save that for next time.